Comments, reactions, objections? Yeah.
I have a kind of fundamental question again, which has to do with the language. The difficulty it is in reading this material for me, and I assume I'm not the only one.
Right.
And I was wondering, since you speak differently from the way that you're writing,
Right.
what prompted the tightness of the language?
Right. The observation you're making about the difference between the way I speak and the way I write is not. This is not the first time I've heard that. Other people have observed that, and I'm not sure that I'm the person to ask why. My own understanding of the difficulty of the text, as opposed to the verbal intercommunication, has to do with the fact that the text represents to me a certain kind of finality.
Faith
No,
and philosophy.
Faith and philosophy, but nevertheless, I had the benefit when I got to faith and philosophy of having thought about this for 30 years. Here, what you're dealing with is somebody who is discovering the thinking now occurring for the first time, and who in chapter 3 doesn't quite realize that there is such a thing as the thinking now occurring. Okay, so there's a lot of tentativeness as well as concentration. So it's a complex thing. So it's a difficult text, but yes. So it's not you. It's certainly not you. I even have trouble with it. Preparing class is a real burden for me.
But Dave, this Novitas Mundi arose out of a series of lectures.
Correct. Well, and so did Faith and Philosophy. The difference
did you
being
complicate did you take the lectures and complicate them when you inserted them into book form? Or
No.
Probably
No. The lectures from which this book came were very close to what you have here. I only did minor revision.
Did you pass out?
The people who heard the lectures had the advantage of the body language and the intonation of me speaking them originally. I think.
Were you interrupted? Were you allowed to be interrupted?
No, these were formal lectures. It wasn't a class situation.
So you didn't read them. You spoke, or did
Well,
you
no,
read
I
them?
read them, but I had a lot of rhetorical training, so I read them in a persuasive way.
Well, I think there's a lot of punctuation here in your rhetoric,
Right.
in your spoken rhetoric, if you will,
Right.
that's missing from here.
Okay.
Do you agree with that?
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So, if,
I have a question.
Sure.
I have so far tried to keep these questions until we are where the question is. But
Okay.
then I find out that
It
time's
moves around.
going
Right.
some
Right.
other way. So I'll ask this question at the beginning.
Right.
Which is somewhere in here, and I even forgot where, there is some statement of humanity and reason being the same thing.
Right.
So I'd like you, I would love to hear what you mean by that.
Okay.
If,
All right.
if possible. And also I'd like to hear whether it's you speaking or Descartes speaking or
Okay.
God speaking.
Right.
Whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. And I don't want to answer it immediately because
Okay.
that's on the agenda
Okay,
for
well,
today,
that's
hopefully.
fine. That's
Yeah.
fine. Then, if
Okay.
that's-
But it's
if
good
that's in
that's good to
suspension.
know. I'll remember when I get to that point to
Okay,
slow it down a little bit.
good.
Any other preliminary questions? Yes.
The question I asked before.
Okay.
I asked Talia too. And I think I got two different answers.
Okay.
And it has to do with the word now and the thinking now occurring. And whether,
I was thinking about you in that question.
Yeah.
So they may be on some psychic wavelength here.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. And you actually said something last week in the process of talking. You said, "Did I say that? Did I say that?" And then you said, "It must have been the thinking now occurring," and just went on talking. Now,
I don't even remember. But
well, I
You have it all
this
down,
has been
right?
on my mind here.
Okay.
So it's whether this is relevant to my question or not, I
Okay.
don't know. But this is how it came up for me again, which is in saying that you seem to be making a distinction between two kinds of activity, two kinds of thinking activity that could be happening right now. One is speaking in the past, as it were, and one is speaking in the present. So, in that sense, I have taken the meaning of the thinking now occurring to be, at least one meaning of it, of the now, to be an atemporal sense of something happening now. So my question was Aristotle engaged in the thinking now occurring then?
I know.
Now, I understand also that there's another sense of the thinking now occurring, which is the thinking now occurring. So I'm wondering if this first sense is also part of your meaning. Namely, would it make sense to think of Aristotle as Aristotle in Aristotle's thinking moment as being engaged in not the thinking now occurring, but was he thinking the thinking now occurring then?
In the now, you mean?
Yes.
And so I was thinking about you and your question the last couple of days, and I was thinking it might be too simple, but it may be correct to say that Aristotle was not doing the thinking now occurring probably in any sense, because he was doing the thinking occurring between nows.
Okay.
He was doing a thinking occurring in time, where time was something that, if you were to isolate it conceptually, is an unbroken continuum,
Yes.
and the now is the break
Yes.
in time. But in the now, strictly speaking, for Aristotle, there would be, as it were, no room for thinking, no
Yeah.
time for thinking in the now.
Yes.
All right, so the now is the closest thing for a temporal being to the eternality of divinity. So it has about it a kind of, later on in the text when we get to, in the second, probably chapter 7 or thereabouts, the book spends some time on Stoicism and understands the Stoic repetition, cosmic repetition, in terms of a kind of extended or temporalized now, where, in other words, Stoicism introduces into the notion of the now an openness, an extensiveness that is completely missing from Aristotle. So the obscurities in Aristotle's text are not deficiencies on Aristotle's part. They're an intrinsic part of his understanding that there is, and what is the now? A limit.
Yeah.
And the limit to thinking,
Yeah.
in one sense of the word, the limit to thinking is the now.
Yeah.
Does that make
Is the
any
now
sense?
related to the unum?
Which now?
Now you just described.
No, the now I'm describing now is Aristotle's now, if I can put it that way. It's a now that is pre-Stoic,
But he was
pre any
between
kind
the
of
nows, the between portion.
right.
Is
The,
that
the temporality of the world.
Yeah.
If you're referring to the unum of the logic of foundation, I see no immediate connection. And that's the best way I can put it. It's just, I haven't thought about that, but I would say in terms of Aristotle's sense of time, it's not related to Aristotle's sense of time, right? Now, I don't know whether I fully answered your question or not.
Well, I think partially. So
Okay. Well, I mean, do you want to give me the part that I haven't?
Only, I'm not sure I can. Right?
Okay.
But
Okay.
let me just ask one thing. In a sense, then, the thinking now occurring is a new thinking.
Oh, yes.
But it's almost as if I'll have to come back to it.
You don't want to try what you're going to say? It was
No,
almost as if what? Almost
Yeah,
as if?
No, I lost it.
Okay.
I'll
see?
come back.
See? That's the thing.
Yeah.
All right.
Can I ask a question
Yeah,
of clarification
sure.
on that? So the now in Aristotle has a sense of not being limited. Is that right? That's
In one sense, it's right, yes. The
the
now
now
is
is-
not limited, but it is the limit of time. It is the marker. It is that which divides up time. Okay. So, in that sense, I mean, it depends on what you mean by limited. It is limited not by something outside of itself. This is good for the Greeks. Okay, it's limited not by something outside of itself. See, we have a notion that the finite is kind of deficient. Right? We got that from the notion that God is infinite. But Aristotle's God, who strictly speaking, now this is only an analogy, okay? Aristotle's God is not in a now, because now is a marker of time, and the eternality of the divine for Aristotle transcends temporality altogether, right? But by analogy, which Thomas is going to draw on, you see, in a more serious way, the temporality of the divine mind is analogously like a now.
Right.
Okay.
That's what I was
Okay. And my point, however, so your question is it limited or unlimited?
Right.
Okay. Well, number one, the now, strictly speaking, now is a limit, but it is intrinsically a limit. It is a limit all the way through, right? In other words, it is limited, but not from without. How is that possible? Because all reality for Aristotle and for the Greeks generally, insofar as it's real, is finite, not infinite. Infinite is an unqualifiedly negative, deficient concept in the Greek mind, right? Because to be without finis, without an end, is to be unintelligible. It's right. In other words, we think with forms. See, images, forms, similitudes, likenesses. Call it what you want. The mind has a form as its object of whatever sort, right? And so, for the Greek, if it's real, it's intelligible. If it's real and intelligible, it's formal. It's finite. It has a definition, we might say, you see, whether it's a verbal, logical definition or a perceptual, conceptual definition. It is this and not something else. Right? So in that sense, the now is not limited by anything else, but it is intrinsically limited. In the way in which God is limited, and that's his perfection, that he lacks, when we say that in Aristotle God lacks all potentiality, that's another way of saying he is perfectly actualized, perfectly formal, perfectly it's a language problem, perfectly, as it were, definite. There are no loose ends in God. Yeah. You going to say something, Chuck?
Yeah, just that even in Aristotle's conception of the mathematical infinity, there is no infinity like in some versions anyway of modern mathematics, in which you could have a finished infinity. There is only a potential infinity. Infinity means it just keeps going. It isn't like you have an infinite number of points in a line or an infinite number of integers and anything like that. You couldn't have such another concept.
Right. Okay. Any other preliminary questions? Yes? No. Okay. I want to back up a little bit because, as you've noticed, we're always running a little behind ourselves. Let's go back into the previous chapter on page 68 and 69 in particular. We kind of skipped over it, although we alluded to it, I guess. But it's a fairly precise passage that I quote toward the about 7 or 8 lines up from the bottom of 68 from the De Anima. Aristotle says, "Now, summing up what we have said about the soul, let us assert once more that, in a sense, the soul is all existing things." Notice, in a sense, and we did touch on this. This is not the point I want to make here, but, the direct point, that the soul is the human soul, the rational soul. In that sense, for Aristotle, to be human and to be rational are interchangeable ideas. Right? The rational animal, the political animal, we would say the human animal. Right? That's what Aristotle was talking about. And that, the mind or the soul of that animal is an intelligence, but it is specifically as human, as human. It is a rational intelligence as opposed to the divine mind, which is, I mean, I'm not even sure the word intuitive is correct in the case of Aristotle's God, right? I mean, Aristotle's God is not exactly intuiting himself or itself, but it's in contact with itself, as Aristotle says. So anyway, the rational soul is all existing things in a sense. That is, and that sense is potentially all existing things. And the point we made a meeting or two back was that when it actually knows any one of all of those things that it is potentially, when it actually knows it, the point we were making is that it knows this particular thing, right? It doesn't know all things at once, okay? Although potentially it does. Actually, it only knows them one at a time, so to speak. The sensitive and cognitive faculties of the soul are potentially these objects, namely the sensible and the knowable. These faculties then must be identical either with the objects themselves or with their forms. Now they are not identical with the objects, for the stone does not exist in the soul, but only the form of the soul. Now this is what I wanted to zero in on, because this is the bone of contention, as it were, between the correct understanding of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas' understanding of Aristotle. Okay, that is, when Aristotle says that the stone doesn't exist in the soul, right? What he's referring to is in that soul, in that intelligence, qua potential intelligence. You see, the question of where the stone is vis-a-vis the soul is mooted in the act of knowledge, right? In the act of knowledge, the rational plane and the level of distinction between actuality and potentiality is transcended. Okay? Now, for Aristotle, that's not a problem. For us, trying to understand how Aristotle can say that and yet not rest content with understanding that rationality exhausts all that needs to be said about the nature of the human mind, right? The nature of the human mind depends upon this divine something or other, this agency, this techne, this, what's the word, as it comes to be called, the agent intellect, right? It depends upon that divine something or other within it, so to speak, in order for it to operate qua rational, you see? And for Aristotle, that's just the way it is. In other words, that he doesn't need to reconcile that irreducible tension. The fact that in order to come to know anything, I must already, in some sense, be without intermission. I must already be engaged in an act of knowledge. Right? For us, that's a kind of a problem. We're not kind of satisfied with that. So it's kind of a contradiction or an unresolved something or other. Okay, that lack of resolution is not Aristotle's problem. He's just describing his experience, or our experience as he understands it. That's all he means to do. Right? He doesn't mean to have an absolute answer to the problem. But Thomas is going to pick up on this, all right, in a very different world, starting with a very different presupposition, what I call that which cannot be a presupposition in today's reading, the presupposition of faith, right, which strictly speaking is not a presupposition, intellectually or metaphysically speaking, okay, but nevertheless, Thomas is starting with the presupposition of faith, which means fundamentally that everything, the whole kit and caboodle of being, as we experience it in the universe of being now, not just the physical universe, but the universe of being, which would include the Aristotelian gods and the prime mover and so forth. All of that is understood by Thomas to have been brought into the state of being for the first time by an omnipotent creative act of a God who absolutely transcends this totality that he has created. And in that context, what will have happened, although I think Thomas can take the credit for making it perhaps fully explicit for the first time, what will have happened is that all of the Aristotelian essence, all of the Aristotelian actuality, that essential activity that is the really real, all of that will have been potentiated. All of the Aristotelian actuality will, vis-a-vis the omnipotent God besides whom there are no other gods, and who has brought the world into being ex nihilo, right? All of the being, all of the actuality of the world, which, as Aristotle understood, by definition, therefore, the eternity of the world is now denied its finality. It's denied its actuality. The world does not contain within itself its own end. You see, this is a great. Aquinas is a good Aristotelian in spirit, not technically. You see, because he has his own paradox, and the Aristotelian, the Thomistic paradox is that we are created for an end beyond ourselves. Right. In other words, yeah, we have an end, right? The world has an end, but unlike the Aristotelian end, which is, as it were, part and parcel of that world, which comes together with the world, which is there always with the world, and the world is always there with it as that end. Our end in the Thomistic universe is beyond ourselves, right? And it is really beyond ourselves. I mean, it's so beyond ourselves that, put it simply, our end is God, right? Okay, fine. And in simple theological terms, so the end is, you live well and so forth and so on, you're saved, you have faith in you, right? And you go to heaven. And then going to heaven means you see God face to face, right? Okay, fine. But for Thomas, we don't have within ourselves the capacity to see God face to face. So and yet that's what we were created to do. See, that's the goal. We have a goal which, left to ourselves, we cannot achieve. So that even going to heaven for Thomas is going to mean that God is going to have to intervene, as it were, again, metaphysically, and he's going to have to impose upon the human form a supernatural. I mean this. I don't mean this in an everyday sense of the word, but beyond the nature of the human soul, another form is going to be imposed by God, added on, so that the human soul, with that additional formation by God, will be able to realize its destiny. So the paradox is, you see what happens when we run into modern atheism. So I think of Sartre here. Sartre came up a lot of times when I was reading Descartes. And this is not accidental, okay? And Sartre, have you read Being and Nothingness? Do people know the text of it? Okay. Well, Sartre is a very interesting guy, and for lots of reasons. But intellectually, he's interesting because while he's a existentialist atheist, he, unlike, for example, Nietzsche, when Nietzsche's atheism throws everything out. I mean, Nietzsche has in a sense, Nietzsche probably is a more radical thinker than Sartre, but Sartre is pretty profound. But Nietzsche has the virtue of saying not only that there's no God, but Nietzsche understands if there's no God, that's because there's no reason. That is to say, implicitly Nietzsche understands that if there is reason, there's a God. Right? You see? He understands that, so he's not stupid. All right, so there's no God. That means there's no reason. That means there's no consciousness. It's a phenomenal. It's a kind of a mist that nature throws up. You see, it's just all a crock. It's all a crock to Nietzsche. You see, but the point is,
You make a long story.
yeah, right. But we could lengthen the story, but he's not in the text. But he's in.
How big a crock is it?
It's a big crock, but it's a very important crock. Very important crock. Profound fellow. In any event, his critique is radically thoroughgoing. I don't want to go off on a lecture on Nietzsche, but I mentioned him because Sartre, of course, comes after him historically, right? And Sartre is presumably as every bit an atheist as Nietzsche is, but he's a little more subtle. And so Sartre's idea, basically, simply put, is that, well, now, wait a minute. You can't throw out the idea of God, right? Which is another way of saying we can't throw out reason. We can't throw out our humanity, exactly. We can't just say it's all a crock, okay? So Sartre gives us this post-Kierkegaardian, atheistic, absurd situation in which we find ourselves, namely that he grants to Aquinas, you see, and implicitly through Aquinas he grants something to Aristotle. In other words, to the extent to which we are rational animals, right, to that extent, of course, we are saddled with this idea of God. Does that mean that the idea of God has any possibility of being realized, that it has any substance to it? No. So Sartre preserves the fact that the idea of God is it's an ineradicable part of our nature to have such an idea, right? But there's no possibility of being fulfilled. So we are eternally frustrated, right, in our attempt to realize what God means to us, right? Now, for Sartre, what God means to us is possession, security, immortality, of course, in theological terms, you see. But the next best thing to immortality is a Cadillac, and a large bank account, right? And lots of descendants, lots of children, and fame, and being on television. So, in other words, if I can possess the world, which I can only do in a limited way, but the more I can possess it, the more I own the world, you say, then the more like God I am, you see. So that's Sartre's reading of what God represents is the ultimate aspiration to possess the world. And of course, maybe he's a good biblical scholar too, because if you read the Old Testament, who is God? He's the landlord. He owns the land. The Jews are just tenants. You see? They don't own the land. All right? So God possesses the world. That's the way Sartre's reading it. Is the image, you see, of our drive to possess the world. Now, what made me think of all of that? Descartes did make me think of all of that, but I want to go back to the potentiality that in Aristotle. Okay, so now Aristotle just doesn't have these problems. I am divine in some core sense. Right? I'm not completely or simply divine. Sorry, I'm not simply divine, but I'm not simply human either. Sorry, that's the way it is. That's Aristotle. He's happy. Now, when Thomas comes on Aristotle after 1,300 years, more or less, well, more than that, because you have 1,700 years. In the meantime, Christianity's been around for almost 1,300 years. And he's got this notion that the world was created ex nihilo. And therefore, as I was starting to say, everything that for Aristotle was actuality is now fundamentally potentiated. It's deprived of its actuality. So when Thomas reads the text, you say that we're referring to here in the De Anima, he says, and I refer to him over on page 69, maybe 15 lines up from the bottom, a little below the middle of the text. Now, Thomas often quotes Aristotle to the effect that the stone does not exist in the soul. But this idea that only the form of the stone exists in the soul, depending upon whether it is said of a metaphysical reason, Aristotle, or a natural reason, Thomas, means different things. For Thomas's presuppositionalist reason, a perfect instrument for knowing things other than itself, a material object is known apart from the individuating principle of its matter. That is, it knows by abstraction of a species the existence of another as an object for itself. But for Aristotle's metaphysical reason, presupposing essential identity, to possess an object's form apart from its matter, as if the latter were the principle of individuality. See, what I've been saying in the book and in class is that the principle of individuality for Aristotle is really the actually existing essence. The matter is subsumed. There is no matter apart from form, and there is no form apart from this level of essential activity, of essential actuality. All right? But for Thomas, that's not the case. All right? For Thomas, the principle of individual, and here you see the beginning of the modern sensuous world in which we live. Now, Thomas is not quite into this modern world that's going to succeed him, all right? But he's laying the groundwork for it, right? He understands conceptually, right, that what individuates is matter. Matter is the individuating principle, and that is it's in a way it's kind of turning. I don't want to overstate this, but it's something like turning Aristotle over. Right? But that's a little too simple a metaphor. But in the process of doing that, all right, in order to make matter a principle of individuality, as I was going to say, that would be bad enough. But to do it consistently, you have to then imagine, as Thomas does, that I can separate the form from the matter. You see that the form has a meaning even apart from its matter, right? So now when I ask Aristotle about the immortality of the soul, he hems and haws. Oh, well, I'm not gonna. Well, maybe that divine part, of course, that's immortal, but of course, I'm not sure that's why you're asking me if the soul is immortal. See, I'm Aristotle. But if you ask Thomas, is the soul immortal? Yes. And what is the soul immortal? Yes, the rational soul, qua rational, is immortal. Now, by the way, that provides him with a very good argument for the resurrection at the end of the world. Because Thomas, now of course, this is very Aristotelian, right? He's got a soul, a form of a body that is able to exist independently of its being actually being the form of matter. So the body rots in the grave, but the soul goes to heaven, waiting for the last judgment and waiting to be reunited with its material, right? Which we think casually is the body, right? Okay. Well, first of all, I mean, Aristotle wouldn't know what he's talking about, right? I mean, he would say, you didn't understand me. You thought I was obscure. You've clarified things. Right? You've got it really. It's really clear, isn't it? You die. Your soul, which was the form of your body, it just keeps on going, right? And your body rots. The matter, returns, blends in with the other matter, and then sometime we'll get it back together and put it back together in form. And all of that has a kind of clarity, doesn't it? You understand? It has a kind of visual. You can even draw that. That's easy, right? But the clarity is purchased at the expense of something that would make no sense to Aristotle, right? The soul, by definition, is the form of matter. So what is it doing? Now, of course, Thomas, who also understands this at some level, you see, says, well, that just shows how reasonable it is to believe in the resurrection. Because here you have a soul that was created in order to be the form of the body, and since we believe that the soul goes to heaven or hell, as the case might be, before the end of the world, it wouldn't be really suitable and fitting for it to remain without its matter for all eternity, would it? Says Thomas. Great. Okay. So because I'm a good Aristotelian, right, I now have a good reason to take seriously the idea of the resurrection from an intellectual point of view. Of course there's going to be a resurrection because the soul is missing something, even though in Thomas he can understand it to perdure without that matter. It's really not fitting to it to perdure without that matter.
So the interregnum between the death of the body and the resurrection is like, in Aristotle, the sense in which ordinary experience is pure potential and exists in a kind of a certain kind of gap in which, from the originating principle of the essence, which precedes the ongoing phenomena, and also awaits its telos, awaits its end when the experience of matter and form will be reassembled in an act of knowledge, in an act of intellect. So that gap, there's a gap
right.
in both cases. So we exist in a kind of potential, in almost the sense of like a potentiated electric charge.
Well, okay,
but we're waiting for it to come to a kind of resolution.
In Thomas, you're certainly waiting. See, I don't think in Aristotle we're actually waiting. I don't think we're waiting for anything.
But there is still some sense in which things are moving towards their end, and that moving towards their end would be like what I'm talking about, that gap.
Okay.
Since from an eternal prospect, they're already there.
Right.
But in actual
but in time, there is a process of the realization of that end.
Yes. Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's interesting because Thomas considers the interesting question as to whether or not the souls in heaven, which would be the substantial forms in his language, or the Aristotelian soul, whether they undergo or experience any change? And Thomas says, well, between now and the end of the world, they do. Because as long as the world continues on in the way it's continuing on, those souls can be assumed to have some interest in its outcome, right? And therefore, they're going to be in some way affected by the temporal changes prior to the end of the world. But after the end of the world, right? Thomas understands that that will be the end of change, even as it were in heaven, which is a very un-American idea. All right? And Jonathan Edwards, whom I mentioned to you before, the central idea is it's just like Detroit. Every year a new model of God. That's gross. Every year a deeper experience. Every year, every aeon, every infinite aeon, there will be a deeper and deeper appreciation and knowledge of the Godhead by the soul in heaven in Jonathan Edwards. So there is not only is there change, but change is called for. It's logically called for because God is the God of Jonathan Edwards is infinitely fathomable, right? And so he's never going to be actually fathomed by the soul that is there to enjoy that Godhead, right? So, but in Thomas, that temporality, and this is all related, sticky wicky business, right? It's all related to this question of time and the now. In Thomas, there will be a cessation of any kind of change, finally, in the relationship between the soul and God, right? So the soul will be once and for all eternity satisfied with God in proportion, from Thomas's point of view. See, this is nice. In proportion to what. Now I'm going to speak pedestrian-wise, but it's vivid. In proportion to whatever shape it's in, right? So the saints are not all. The saints are.
Same level.
They're not all on the same level.
Like in Dante's Paradise,
right.
It's different.
And so everybody got in the door, but some are in better shape than others. All right, and the shape you're in defines. See, the shape I am confronting the divine is the definition of how I will experience God. And the larger my shape, the more capacity I have, the more I'll get, the lesser. But the great thing about it is, since we're not looking over our shoulder, right? What do I care? I got everything I want. Do you see? In other words, I'm perfectly satisfied. I'm not jealous of somebody else's being in better shape because my shape is perfectly satisfied by God.
Bunch of Schweig's little hot rolls. Sheldon Leckham story about this poor little saint who dies, and God says, you can have anything you want. And he said, well, I would like every morning to have some nice hot rolls. And that's his boon in eternity.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of Frank J. Tipler. What would you call him? A mathematical physicist.
Cosmologist.
Tulane wrote a book in 1994, published by Doubleday, called something like The Physics of Immortality or something. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And Tipler, it's really a wild book because Tipler, this fellow is not a fringe. There's some people on the fringe like me, right? He's not fringe. He's right there in the center of things.
He's fringe.
Well, he's fringe, but he's fringe.
He fringed himself with that book.
Well, with the book, right. But what I'm saying, I mean before that.
Yeah, no, he the
Cosmologist?
anthroposophic principle is his baby.
Okay. Anthroposophic, right? Now you got me doing it.
I know.
Anthropic. It's the anthropic
yeah,
principle. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, Tipler's heaven, which he justifies as a possibility, by the way. He is scientific in this sense, right? He has a theory about the ultimate destiny of the universe, which will come to Teilhard de Chardin's Omega point, and that will take place approximately 100 billion years from now. Not that it will necessarily take place, but the probabilities are such, and he lays out a whole mathematical 100 pages or so to make that intelligible to his fellow mathematicians. But the point being, your story reminded me of it, was that in his heaven, if it should happen this way, everybody will be able to, in effect, define their own heaven. So if your thing is restaurants or rolls or whatever, then that's what you'll get. Right? Okay. Now, just to go back to Jonathan Edwards, go back to the shape idea, which is also relevant to American pragmatism, to Peirce and so forth, and to Dewey and James, all of those guys. Jonathan Edwards says in the early part, in the colonial period up there in New England, when he wasn't chatting with the Indians and getting thrown out of his pulpit by his disgruntled congregation because he was too rigorous, too demanding, in his theological work in heaven, what's going to happen, according to Jonathan Edwards, is not only that I'm going to have an infinite progress in my appreciation of the Godhead, but in order for that to happen, a little bit like Thomas, that means that the shape I'm in, to use my metaphor, is going to expand, right? In other words, if I'm going to have more and more of the Godhead, I've got to grow. So growth, right? Now what I'm talking about here, I'm using this theological example because it's relevant to Thomas, but to abstract from it a little bit, what you're talking about there always is form growing, form developing, right? Not being an eternally unchanging something or other, right? And so when you get to the pragmatist, somebody like Peirce, I think I've already mentioned this, Peirce says, the Platonic ideas, of course there are Platonic ideas. No problem for an American to think that Plato was right about the ideas, except that they're evolving. There's a world of eternal ideas, and those ideas are undergoing an evolution. That's what Peirce is saying. See? So there's a deep consistency there between Jonathan Edwards and Peirce. But back to Thomas, he's not quite there. We're only in the 13th century, and so things are moving, but he's still got his ties to Aristotle, and one of his ties is that the ultimate answer is, we would say, static. All right, I have to be careful there because the static for Aristotle is life, is activity, but static in the sense of missing change and growth of the form itself. Growth within the form, but not growth of the form, right? Because the forms have not yet, and Thomas is in the process of bringing this about, they have not yet themselves been potentiated. They have not yet themselves had their ultimate actuality, their original actuality, challenged. You see? So the creation of the world pulls the rug out from under the unchanging forms. So the great irony of all this to do about evolution and Darwin and so on, the irony is that outside of the Christian West, that would never have, Darwin doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to Aristotle, right? But in a world that all of a sudden, now, of course, in the 20th century, we've caught up, right, in science, right? Not only the biologists, but now the physicists are telling us in the last 50 years, we realize, right, that it's only in the last 50 years that this has become a respectable theory, right? We've been around since the early part of the 20th century, is the Big Bang. That the universe, from a physical point of view, in some sense, now not maybe strictly speaking, in the sense which Thomas would accept it, but at least analogously, the physical universe now has a beginning. It starts from a singularity, right? Okay, so...
Well, there's also the question of morphogenesis, that we're in the present day. Right. This question of the evolution of forms is an extraordinarily interesting question because it doesn't reverse Darwin, but it deepens the issue about what is a form, what kinds of forms are there, what forms are permanent, at least for the age of the universe, which forms are themselves undergoing evolution. And
I think that I want to give all the credit for that, the deep credit intellectually, to somebody like Peirce. No, for Peirce. I want to give it to Peirce approximately. The evolution of forms is really... So he's an evolutionist, but he's not simply a Darwinian, even in the 19th century. You see, he's way ahead of himself or of his contemporaries. Okay, back here to follow this point out. On page 69, toward the bottom there, at the bottom line, the objects of such knowledge would exist only potentially. All right, so for Thomas, on the contrary, over on page 70, such an object is known to exist actually. That is a material. So in other words, before the act of knowledge, right, the Aristotelian object is known potentially, right, and to the extent to which the act of knowing and actuality coincide, right, then Thomas is not going to. Aristotle is not going to think as Thomas does, right, that object, as it were, over there, okay, actually exists, and that I am dealing in my act of knowing with that object as it exists actually. See, in Aristotle, I am dealing with that object as it exists potentially, right, but not actually. So, through this somewhat technical or fine kind of distinction in the epistemological type of distinction between Aristotle and Thomas, that what's going on here is I think you should be able to see through this that the world of our experience is taking on, in its material state, an actuality that's absent in an Aristotelian universe, right? So the world is becoming more real, or it's understood to have a reality. So this is the paradox of creation, right? The world, right? Give me your actuality, and I will give it back to you, so to speak, right? And I'm going to give it back to you in a more real way, in a more tangible way than you have it in that universe in which it keeps escaping me, in which the actuality which I can understand and some sense glimpse, okay, is never standing still for me there, because it's like the now of our psychological experience. It's elusive. It's always just out of reach. Do you see? And so the definition of essence, which I emphasized in the first chapter, is not what it, in Thomas goes back and forth. Erat and est. What it was to be, he understands as Aristotle, and what it is to be. See? So Thomas, that flexibility in Thomas, he can use the Aristotelian language, but he's very comfortable saying that the essence of something is what it is to be that thing. Well, what do you mean what it is? How do you know what it is to be that thing? Do you see? In Aristotle, you don't know what it, you know what it was to be that thing. You see? So the pastness, right, the elusiveness in Aristotle is missing now in Thomas, right? We're now getting a kind of language is the problem. It's kind of a transparency, a kind of openness, a kind of the world itself. In fact, I think somewhere in the syllabus and elsewhere, I speak of the knowledge of the transcendent. Now, language is very ambiguous in philosophy, right? So, transcendent can suggest a number of things. Transcendent, off the chart, beyond my comprehension. It can mean that. But from a phenomenological point of view, the transcendent world, from the point of view of somebody like Husserl, okay, the transcendent is not some otherworldly place. The transcendent, that's the transcendent, right? That which is other than my subjectivity, other than my transcendental realm in which I am related to something. That something is transcendent to the transcendental realm. If it were not transcendent to the knower, right, in being known, if it weren't transcendent to the knower, then we'd be in solipsism, which is one of the big problems of the moderns. Descartes has the problem, right? Thomas raises the issue in anticipation. See, Thomas says somewhere in our reading, somebody said, what you know is the species. So what you know is the species. So you don't really know the thing. You just know the form or the image of the thing. That's the objection that he considers. Remember that passage? And he says, no. I understand why you're saying that, but of course that would be foolish, because then anything that anybody thought would be true, and that's bad science, right? And also we wouldn't know anything other than ourselves, right? So what's his answer to that? Thomas's answer is because the mind, reflecting upon itself, understands that the form that it possesses, the similitude, the likeness of the thing, all right, is that by means of which it knows the object. Right? So it's a little complicated. But so in Thomas, the reason I can know the natural object, and the actual object can be knowable to me, is because I abstract from it, the mind abstracts from it, its form, and then by means of, as an instrument, this is the important point, instrumentally, using the species as an instrument, it knows the object, right? To the extent to which it knows the object. Now, of course, it knows the object only in and through its likeness in the mind, right? So it doesn't know the object substantially, which is the point we were trying to make last time, okay? But it does know the object, and it knows it because the species has become an instrument of its knowing things other than itself in the act of knowing. Right? Now, this notion of the species as instrument, if that were all there were to it, I'm not sure we would have ever gotten to modernity. It's not just that the species in the mind is an instrument. It's not just that the actuality of the human mind, which in Aristotle was something divine, paradoxically or not, in Aristotle, the actuality of the human mind, qua actual, was something divine. Sorry. It's not just that that's no longer true now. It's, at best, an image of the divine, which is interesting. See? It's a similitudo of the divine. So in other words, here's the point. It's not just that the intelligible species of the thing being known by the human mind is an instrument and a similitude, but the human mind at its highest core, right, no longer being itself an eternal divine something or other, is itself a similitude, is itself an instrument. And Sartre, I love these atheists, they're great, okay? Sartre, being in nothingness, part of the frustration of being human in the middle of the 20th century, right, in Sartre's world, is what? That I have to do a little Sartre here. I'm in the center of the universe, but don't get worried, so are you. But that's the hell of it. We're all at the center of the world. Now, you know sooner or later war's going to break out. See? If everybody thinks of themselves. Now, you understand, this is not a psychological problem for Sartre. This is an ontological problem. Where's the other Adam? He's into ontology, right? This is an ontological problem for Sartre, right? This is not a question of bad guys and good guys. To be human is to be in the predicament that every, what he calls for itself, is the center of the world. And that's just the structure of our consciousness, you say? And so, inevitably, life is life. You want to know why you have all the problems you have? That's why. That's the basic answer, right? Now, you can deal with it in different ways. You can deal with it by going to war. You can deal with it by love. So you can try and appropriate the freedom of the other, kind of get their center, locked into your center, to say. Or better, put your center at the center of their center. See, and that's called love. It's a very cynical view of the Sartre. It's not good to read when you're young. And but of course it's sobering. And then another good tactic, and this is good on the subway, is indifference. You just don't look. You just don't pay any attention. You just make believe, as long as you can get away with it, right? That there are no other centers of the universe there. Now, what was the point? The point is that when I look closely, when I zero in on Sartre's understanding of human being, what he sees there is that the world, insofar as I and every other for itself, every other subjective human consciousness, is the center of the universe, center of the world, then that world is a complex, of instrumentality for this center. In other words, the world is what I use, right? And I can use it by not using it. But in other words, why aren't I in Iraq? Or why aren't I down at Times Square protesting? Well, I've made some decisions. Whether I reflected upon them or not is not the issue. The issue is this is my world, and if I wanted to be in Times Square, I'd be in Times Square. If I wanted to enlist and go to Iraq, I'd be there. Right? So I have chosen the world in which you and I don't see it exactly the same. See, there's a commonality, but all right. So the world of which I'm the center is my own doing. I could change this world significantly in a heartbeat. Not to say completely, of course, that's part of the frustration, you see, because there is no God, and I can't, right? So no miracle in that sense. So the point being, the world is an instrument for my subjectivity in Sartre. And what is this thing at the center of the world? And this is come back to Thomas and to Descartes. This thing for which the world is an instrument is an instrument. Right? It is itself an instrument using other instruments. It's fundamentally an instrument. The way he puts it, Sartre does it nicely because he's doing all this existentially and not metaphysically, although he is ontologically, he's not metaphysical. And so existentially what he understands is that I am the instrument that I can't quite grasp. You see, in other words, I am an instrument using instruments, but I am an instrument that I can't simply control myself. Right? There's the fact that I was born, for example. That's the concrete existential proof that I'm an instrument that can't take hold of itself. I had no choice over that, right? So here I am. This is also coming out of Heidegger, right? The thrownness of being, right? I'm thrown into the world. Okay. So where did Sartre come with this idea? I mean, did he invent it? No, he didn't invent it. Now he's using it. He's articulating it in the middle of the 20th century in a profoundly original way, right? I mean, he's doing it in a way that not been done hitherto. But the seeds of it go back to Thomas and become even clearer, I think, in Descartes. That is to say, all right, so let me throw in the theological thing, which I think is so simple but so true. When you ask Thomas, what's the incarnation all about? I mean, metaphysically, what's it all about? And what it's all about is that the incarnation, technically the incarnation is the definition of the Council of Chalcedon, which I mentioned in the 5th century, is certainly they never would have done this. They would never have drawn this picture during the council. And this is not adequate, but it just visualizes the point I want to make. All right. The Orthodox doctrine is that there are two natures, the divine and the human, but there's one person. Okay? So what does it mean that God became a man, a human being? Does it mean that he kind of co-opted Alia or somebody like Alia, right? That here's a human being, and I'm going to become that person.
Walk in.
Yeah, whatever. Okay.
Is that what happened? Explains a lot. Thank you.
So the answer is no. Right? Well, then what does it mean, technically speaking? It means, in Thomas's language, right, that, and what you can see here in this little very crude representation, the notion that there's only one person and two natures. The key thing here is that there's only one person. It would be relatively simple if there were two people and two natures, kind of blended or mixed in together or taking turns or whatever, or walking in or out, whatever the theatrical term is, I don't know. But the really tough part of it, analogous to the difficulty of trying to get your mind around the fact that there are three persons that are nevertheless only one God, analogously, the incarnation, when you look at it closely, has that same kind of problem. It's a little easier, however, to explain if you're Thomas. And the way Thomas explains it is, the one person, of course, is originally, this is also a very Catholic or medieval way of looking at things, it gets blurred when you get to the Protestant era, all right? The Protestantism blurs this difficult distinction because it's kind of modern, and it doesn't like all this difficulty, right? But the classical, and it's operating in the 13th century still in Thomas's thinking, the classical idea is that the two natures are in no way confused. There's no leakage here, okay, between the human and divine. So the problem analogous to three persons who is one God, analogous problem is one person who is two natures, two separate and distinct natures. The unity of the natures is not natural unity, it's personal unity, which, by the way, has always struck me. There's a book here somewhere. If anybody wants to write it, I'm not sure I will. But in other words, right there in the incarnation, you have and another use of the word now, see, the transcendence of person to nature. Forget the whole issue of human and divine, right, which is kind of a major issue, right? But just set it aside a moment, bracket it in your head. The incarnation already says logically that somehow or other person trumps nature. So the roots of your existentialism, whether it's theistic or atheistic, are already there. Do you understand? Because what is Sartre saying in that book, that big fat 800-page book about being and nothingness? right? Among other things, what is he saying? Among other things, he's saying existence precedes essence, put it in classical terms, or a little more concretely, Sartre has the nerve to tell me, and he's fighting Leibniz, by the way, when he does this, explicitly, that I chose my nature. Don't tell me I have a human nature and that therefore I'm... Right? Well, maybe you have a human nature and therefore you're doing certain things certain way, but you are responsible for having a human nature. See, now if I go back to Kant, they were supposed to have... I'm only carrying this around because we're still behind. We got the tables, but we didn't get the blackboard today. But I like a blackboard, as you can see. I'm really struggling to have one. Freedom, right? Personhood, going back to Kant. In Kant, you want to do triunes, because Kant started the Trinity off. If it wasn't for Kant, Hegel wouldn't, we'd have to start from scratch. It would have been very awkward. Kant, in his moral philosophy, and most particularly in his book called Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, spends a good deal of time talking about human nature, but this is fundamental to all of his thinking. And he makes a kind of Aristotelian distinction. That is, there's an animal level, and then there's a rational level for Kant, and then there's a level of personhood. Right? So Kant has the idea that personality, and by the way, it's the level of personhood is the level of responsibility, you see, that goes beyond the simply rational, right? We would say in everyday pedestrian language, it's personal responsibility, right? In other words, it's not just enough to know, right? It's what are you doing about it? How are you acting, right? And there you're into the level of freedom and decision and responsibility. So the fact that freedom becomes such a big thing in the modern world, that's all we're talking about. Presumably, I don't want to start another discussion here, right? This is just an academic point. Presumably, we're in Iraq to what is it called? Operation Free Iraq or something, isn't
Iraqi freedom.
Iraqi freedom. Okay? Forget the substance. Look at the mindset. Look at the categories in which we understand what we're doing. Right? And of course, it has a lot of political things, but where do we get this notion that freedom is it? Right? Where do we get the notion that human persons somehow are the... Right? What about all these natural differences? Race, height, intelligence, there are a lot of natural differences. Right? But the notion of the equality, you see, the created equality, as Jefferson calls it, of all men, meaning, of course, men and women, of all human beings, is rooted in the notion of personality. Right? So I'm saying, when you go back to the incarnation as originally defined in the 5th century, the seeds of this priority of personhood to nature are right there in the very understanding of what we're believing. You see? Okay. Now, that was not the point of the incarnation. Maybe it was the point of the incarnation. Okay. But at this stage of the game, the point is to say that in the case of this particular person, there are these two natures but nevertheless, they are not blended. They remain distinct, and the unity of the two natures is a personal unity. All right.
Why do you talk about the incarnation in the past tense?
Well, because if it really occurred, it occurred in the past.
It isn't occurring.
Well, now wait a minute.
Still?
Is there anything that occurred in the past that isn't still having its effect? Aristotle still has an effect. We're talking about it.
Well, I thought we agreed that Christ had become man.
Oh, well, now you bring me back to my point. Let me finish my technical point, and then you come back at me, okay? Because that's what I wanted. That's where it started me on this. All right, he became man. That's right, and therefore the strict understanding is that what we're dealing with here is that this person who didn't have to do anything to be a divine person had to assume what, though? That's the point. What was assumed in the incarnation? Not a man was not assumed. What was assumed was humanity. You see? What was assumed was the human nature. Well, now, wait a minute. The human nature, and this is part of the logic of it, is common to everybody in the room. Right? See? So when the divine word assumes human nature, right, that relates the divine word again, and notice, qua person, it relates the divine word to all individuals that have that nature through the nature, right? Not through any kind of distinguishing individuality, but through the commonality of the human nature. Now, you want to make your point now? I have another point to make.
Well, to the extent that big picture was,
Right.
The history of thought
Right.
can be stated to be God became man, then God became thought,
What you?
right? In time. That's what I'm driving. So and the new thinking, as I understand it, is constantly bringing that incarnation into the world, and that's what makes it a new world.
Okay.
So to talk about, I don't mean to quibble,
Right.
but
I know you don't.
Right.
Because I know you so
Nature.
well.
It's in my nature. But to be precise in your language and to hear you talk about the incarnation was, I think you need to add something to that. And maybe that goes back to what we were talking about, we humble students earlier when this got started. Why is this language so complex? And I see in this room, you can say something like, the incarnation was.
And then you're going to
But
object.
in this book, you have to add, without any punctuation, of course, then on the other hand.
Right.
That's
right.
That's the problem that's the difference between the book and you speaking here.
Okay.
And I think I could speak for all of us and venture to say that we all enjoy listening to you much more than we do reading you.
Okay. All right. Is that what you want to do? I want to
I'm
make.
going to leave now.
You're going to leave. I know you're leaving early. I hope you're not going to leave that
that's
early.
changed. That's changed.
Okay.
Life has changed. Stay.
Now, but here's the key point I want to get to, which goes back to Sartre and to the whole of the modern thought, is that this divine person, who didn't need to do anything to be the divine person, needed to do something analogous to creation, by the way, just as the God who created the universe ex nihilo does so, as Thomas, I think I quote him somewhere in here.
Now, if I can interrupt 1 second, you say he needed to do this. Do you mean that literally?
What did I say?
You said this person needed.
In order to become
Yeah.
He needed to become human.
No, I didn't say that. No.
Human, he's
But
got to do
No, I
something.
said if he were to become human, he had to do something.
But did he need to become?
No, you said
No, he didn't need to
choice.
become. No, he absolutely
There
did
was
not.
absolute choice here. On the
Absolutely.
part of, okay.
According to Thomas. Now we're doing Thomas. This is
Yeah.
Thomas. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. For Thomas, you understand, not for Hegel. This is an important point.
Yeah.
Right? When we get to Hegel, God cannot be God unless he becomes human. Okay? But in Thomas, Thomas has got this base covered. Right? He doesn't know about Hegel exactly, but maybe he had a vision, in a cell there late at night, and say, "Maybe I better put that in there somewhere." That did God need to become a human being? Was the incarnation necessary? Yeah. And on a number of levels, even if God wanted to save the world from damnation, did he have to do it in this way? And Thomas says no. He thinks it was a suitable way. It was appropriate. Nothing unsuitable about it. It has lots of things recommended, but it was not necessary. Clearly not necessary. But the point I want to get to is that, so you don't want to quibble. I'm glad you're not a quibbler. When the divine person assumed the human nature, it assumed the human nature. It had to do something. Was the point I would make. He had, eternally, it's divine, but it had to become human, and that's analogous to the freedom that is exercised by the Godhead in creating the world. Right? That the world is not a necessary emanation, as it might be in a Neoplatonic world, or it's not a necessary internal. It's not necessary to the internal logic of the Godhead as it is in Hegel. You see, but it's a free act on the part of God to create the world, and it's a free, unnecessary decision on His part to do so in this particular way. All right.
And the structure of freedom is binary choice. Because this is getting ahead to the Descartes material, where that seems to be.
Okay.
There isn't some possibility of some other sense of what
Some
freedom is.
Yeah, I think that's true. Certainly in the case of Descartes, and maybe implicitly in Thomas. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, are you saying that, as we all know from looking at that sign that appears magically in all end zones of football games, John, there's this citation to John,
Oh, yeah,
whatever it is.
Right,
I think
right,
it is
right.
that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, right?
Right.
But if God is love, as is commonly
Right.
attested to today in most religious, well, many religious gatherings, shall we say,
Right.
then how are you saying that he had no choice, or are you saying that he had no choice about saving the world, but he had only a formal choice? Could have done it in some other way.
Oh. Well, don't ask me what I'm saying. Let's say, what would Thomas answer that? Thomas would say,
Right.
no, he definitely had a choice. It was definitely an act of will. It was definitely a volitional act. So,
But he could have done it in various ways.
that's right. He need not have done it in this particular
In this
manner.
particular-
Okay. Now, the point I wanted to get to was that when you look at Thomas, when you read Thomas and understand how he thinks about this human nature that has been assumed by this divine person in order to save the world, out of love, whatever. Technically speaking, the humanity is the instrument by which the Godhead, we would say, right, in the person of the Word, saves the world. All right. So humanity, in Thomas's understanding, humanity. You started off by saying, well, what's the connection between humanity and rationality? Okay. Reason. Okay. And all right, reason is that distinguishing form of the human intelligence, right? It's what makes this animal human, is that it is rational, right? That it has reason. Zoon ekon logon, it's the living man. This is the original of the Latin rational animal. The living being who has or possesses the logos, that possesses reason in that sense. That's the specific definition of what it means to be human for Aristotle. So to go back to the technical thing about the epistemology here, the difference between Aristotle and Thomas, it's rooted in the fact, right, that in a certain sense, and maybe particularly so in the case of human being, given the incarnation, the human nature is radically an instrument, right? In other words, but it's an instrument in the sense that it does not. It is as it were. It is completely an instrument because it no longer has within itself that essential identity, as I put it in the early chapter. It no longer has within itself that divine transcendence as its motor. Do you see? As its true self, as its and this also comes up a little bit in Descartes. I don't think he's conscious of it, but it's interesting. I noticed it in one of the things that I quote from him. It no longer has that true self as the skill or the techne that forms things, right? Which we say is the highest part of the human soul in Aristotle. And so just to anticipate a little bit Descartes, we'll get to it hopefully in the text, but just to round out the thought a little bit where we're going here, or where I'm trying to go. It's not new that there is implicitly in Aristotle, if the highest part of the soul is a techne, is a skill, then those potential faculties of the soul that he refers to there, you see, in the stone is not in the soul, on the level of potential knowledge, the level of the faculties of the soul, the faculties in the Greek is duname, powers of the soul, the potential level of the human knower, qua dynamic. This is interesting. We get dynamic. Qua moving thinker whose thinking is emotion, is a potentiality, right? That, of course, implicitly in Aristotle is an instrumental level, but Aristotle would never understand the whole of our being to be simply instrumental, right? So if the human nature that is assumed by the Word is the instrument of divine salvation, right, and the person who would be now, I guess, I don't know whether I made this, I'm assuming this, I guess, in the way I'm thinking, that the person here is in the place, it's in the place of that true self, of that of that highest part. You see that? In other words, so in the case of one human being at least, we have a human being who and all other human persons, by virtue of the participation of them all, as it were, equally in humanity. Right?
So this is analogous to Aristotle's sprinkling of the divine around the various souls.
Well, I think what's analogous, I have to be careful there. I think there is an analogy. I think the analogy would be it's a kind of sprinkling of the divine in the sense of a kind of original freedom. There's a kind. Right. When I say that here you have implicit the raising of personality, as it were, above nature, then I think maybe not so simply and directly as in Aristotle. Right. It's not a given because remember, something had to happen here. Something had to there had to be a history. Something really had to happen, and it had to happen in a certain time from where we're sitting in the past. It had to have happened. You see. So with all of those qualifications, nevertheless, I say yes, one of the outcomes of that is now that and see what becomes so important in Christianity? So important, do you believe? Have you heard the word? Do you accept it? Do you relate yourself? In Protestant Christianity takes this in spades, right? Do you have a personal relationship with the Lord? You see? Okay, well that is an extremely unmetaphysical way, thanks to modernity, all right? But the root of it is there in Christianity all the way through, right? So I need somehow or other to be related to this person in order to realize my full, I don't know whether destiny is the right word, but to realize the end for which I was created, right? And therefore, in that sense, to realize the fullness of my personhood.
Historically, is this a creation of Thomas or of the earlier?
Well, this crude diagram.
Century.
Yeah, that's the council. That's dogma. That's dogma. Yeah. I think that the uniqueness of Thomas, or his contribution or his originality, comes here in this thoroughgoing understanding of the instrumentality of humanity in this event. And so what I'm saying is that when you look at, in everyday terms, what does Descartes want? What does he want? What's his project? What's his goal? What's he doing? Well, he'll tell you, he wants, in the simplest possible terms, he wants a useful science.
Solve all problems.
Yeah, but it's got, in other words, what's missing in the science that precedes him for 2,000 years or so is it's useless. It's useless. Now, it's useless for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is that there's no agreement. It's rooted in this dubious, defective human intellect, and that's a problem. Okay, but nevertheless, what does he want to do? He wants a useful science, which in today's reading, somewhere along the line, he says, ultimately we want some good medicine. What we really want to do is be healthy. I mean, after all, don't we want to be healthy? Bottom line, okay. I've always thought in our culture, if there's a real religion, it's health.
America.
Yeah, everybody. Yeah, right. Health is it, right? Now, you see, you can be dismissive of that, but remember what I said about Augustine. Augustine, you have to go back 1,500 years. When Augustine thought of the resurrection, you know what he thought of? Health. Now, he wasn't going to get out of a bottle, you see, but the resurrection meant concretely to Augustine. What is an abstract, otherworldly idea in the sense in which the medieval world kind of gives us that image? For Augustine, the resurrection was a powerful idea because it was the way in which we were going to get a healthy body, and the ultimate index of health is that you don't drop dead, you don't die, right? So the two things achieved in the crucifixion were the life of the restoration of the life of the soul and the restoration of the life of the body. And for Augustine, Augustine's great. He's just great. In the end of the City of God. Now, this is in 400 or thereabouts, right? Whenever he's writing this thing. And he's saying, I don't think you'd find a passage like this in Thomas. Augustine has got a problem. And he's thinking, the body's going to be resurrected. Okay. All right. Okay. We believe that. So that's easy. But he was an intellectual, see, because he would never stop with that. So now he's going to, what does that mean? He's trying to figure out, what does that mean? Does that mean, here's his problem. Oh, hey, don't tell me I'm going to see God with the eyes of my soul. Hey, I know that. I'm a good Neoplatonist, right? Wait a minute. If the body's going to be real, right? Augustine's problem is, does that mean I'm going to be able to see God with my eyes? How would that? Wait a minute. God is a spiritual being. How can I see? What's good at having a resurrected body, right? With which I'm going to enjoy my relationship with God for all eternity? Well, is it going to be de trop, as Sartre would say? Is it going to be no point to it? Right? See? Going to be too much, or is it going to look at how things? Did I say that? Did I say that? Is it going to be of no use? Is the body going to be of no use in heaven? Do you see? Well, if I can't see God with my eyes, he doesn't elaborate, right? This is his problem, though. When he really understands, he intuitively feels that it would be of no use. Therefore, he thinks he's bold enough to say he doesn't know how it could possibly be. He can't quite explain how it could be the case. But he's pretty much coming down on the side that we're going to somehow or other we're going to be able to see God with our eyes.
Well, he forgets there'll be sex in heaven, but the point about
it goes back to give him some rolls.
72 raisins.
But wait a second. Look, the problem with that.
Tell me you're heaven. I'll tell you who you are.
Right. But the problem with what you drew there is that the free person, does not want to be an instrumentality.
Well, now, so that's very interesting.
Wherein does freedom consist when you are completely an instrumentality?
That's the only freedom.
Yeah, that's what.
That's what I was saying is that another sense of freedom, in which freedom is not a matter of making binary choices, but is the freedom, for instance, to perfectly enact one's nature,
right.
to fill one's role. Are there any obstacles to that? One doesn't have cramps in the arm while one's trying to actually hammer the building together. That it's your job to build, in which you take perfect joy in doing, and would do it perfectly freely. So you could find a binary choice, I'll do it rather than not, but that isn't the essence of freedom. The essence of freedom is being able to do the thing that one feels it's one's role to do, or energy
that one
to do.
Feels.
Yeah. Whatever.
Not the what the thinking feels.
Well, okay, but if you keep making that jump, we want to take it one step at a time.
Okay.
But it's true that eventually in here, faith is going to be defined essentially as being at the disposal of. Okay, so that's the thinking now occurring way of talking about something like this instrumentality. Okay, maybe a little more to be said about that, right? But anyway, so there is that connection. But in Thomas, that's in today's reading, we have Thomas's answer to that, right? As exegesized or whatever it is by Leahy. See, we need an editor for this thing, right? Because we have to put the right words in and spell it correctly. In the whole discussion here of mercy and charity, okay? So, which is on pages 73 through 75 or thereabouts. And just to get to the nub of that, at the top of page 75, quoting Thomas in the Summa Theologica, in itself, mercy takes precedence of other virtues, for it belongs to mercy to be bountiful to others, and what is more, to succor others in their wants, which pertains chiefly to one who stands above. Hence, mercy is accounted as being proper to God, and therein his omnipotence is declared to be chiefly manifested. Let me just stop there. This is an interesting idea, which I like to quote once. I quoted somewhere in one of the footnotes in Faith and Philosophy, too. It strikes me as a very subtle point, but very powerful, that the chief manifestation of the omnipotence of the divine is mercy, right? So, what is he comparing it to in his mind? Why does he say the chief? Are there other ways in which we can understand the omnipotence of God? Well, the most obvious other way in which we understand divine omnipotence is metaphysically. That is, creation ex nihilo, we said, is done not by a most powerful prime mover, who is nevertheless intrinsically a finite power, and therefore as such, and perfectly finite, right? Perfectly self-sufficient, right? But on the other hand, not powerful enough, the particular agent, as Thomas would understand the prime mover, not powerful enough to bring the creation into existence or bring it into being out of nothing whatsoever. So therefore, it's co-eternal. The moving universe is co-eternal with the motor of its motion, the cause of its motion, you see. Whereas the God of the Bible creates the world ex nihilo, which metaphysically translates into there is no... And so I keep making the point in Aristotle that the reason we find it difficult to read Aristotle or to understand him is that he doesn't assume that there's any separable matter or separable form and matter from eternal actual essence. Right? If you've got essence and you have a natural world, then they have to be co-eternal. They can't be separated from. They're not. There's no disconnect there in Aristotle. Right? That disconnect in creation ex nihilo, right, putting it positively, is that the God who creates the world out of nothing metaphysically means, what does it mean, out of nothing? Well, there was nothing before the first moment of time, which Thomas says, and we pointed out in the text somewhere, right, which cannot be demonstrated, because he's Aristotelian enough to think that the first now, right, is a contradiction in terms, because every now is the end or the limit of a preceding period of time. So we believe that there is a first now, which already means that whether he's fully focused on it or not, implicitly we have a new understanding of what now means. Right? Right? Whether we've thought it out or not, that's implicit. If we take that as a, if we just assume that, if that's the postulate, then there's got to be a...
This is your zero that's not nothing?
The unum. I don't know.
Well, I mean, you seem...
I don't know, but I can't think about it.
I'm sorry, okay. I just...
Yeah.
That's what I'm working on.
I would say it's related, but I don't have a ready answer for you.
Okay.
Because I'm trying to...
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Okay, that's all right. So now, what does it mean positively to say that the world, metaphysically positively, that the world is created ex nihilo? It would mean in Aristotelian jargon, in Thomistic jargon, that when the world came to be for the first time, what do you mean the first time? The first now. Prior to that, there was neither matter nor form. Now, just to show you the difference from what a classical mind would say, you have it, we've already alluded to it, I think the first day in the Timaeus, Plato's Timaeus, when Plato thinks about the creation of the world. It's not an idea that didn't occur to him. Some people say because he actually was in touch with the Old Testament, right? So that he had such a notion. I don't think there's any way of demonstrating that, but anyway, but it's conceivable. But in any event, in his own way, in the Timaeus, he likes the idea of the myth of the demiurge creating the world. But you'll notice in Plato is not so infatuated with likely stories that he would consider it even a likely story, right? That the demiurge didn't have any matter to work with. Right? So in other words, when Plato imagines the formation of the world, right, he understands that there's an eternally existing model for this world. This is not ultimately real world. It's a derivatively, reflectively real world. And as such, the demiurge is the kind of intermediary between these eternal existing forms and their reproduction, as it were, right, in what is effectively an eternally existing receptacle, he calls it. Now that receptacle, Aristotle, have to wait for Aristotle to clarify this. That receptacle, there's a receptacle for the forms that the demiurge is going to put into it in order to make the world of our experience. But the receptacle is there. The demiurge does not make the receptacle.
So the receptacle is matter?
It's effectively matter in Aristotelian terms. Yeah, right, exactly. So the demiurge doesn't make the matter. He doesn't make the receptacle. He doesn't make the potentiality. Right? So omnipotence means to Thomas that God creates the world ex nihilo means that God makes the world. Not only does he make a world the forms of which are now for the first time in matter, more radically, he makes forms that didn't exist. Remember, the demiurge's forms eternally exist. Everything is modeled on an eternally existing Platonic universe. Right? So these forms are coming into existence for the first time. Now, that isn't bad enough. So we've already got Darwin waiting in the wings. He's got to wait a long time, but he's waiting. But the matter in which the forms, or with which the forms are joined, is all the potentiality. There was no potentiality for the... Well, wait a minute. If there was no potentiality for the world, and you made one, you must have what? All potentiality within your grasp. You must be omnipotent. Do you see? That's what omnipotence means metaphysically to Thomas. But the great thing is, hey, I can get my mind, Johnny Carson, you remember Johnny Carson? Johnny Carson's idea on the Tonight Show was, if you buy the premise, you buy the bit, meaning the skit, right? You buy the premise, you buy the bit, right? So that's the comedic way of saying you suspend disbelief if you want to read a novel, okay? So if you buy the premise, right, then you buy the bit. If the premise is that God created the world ex nihilo, then the bit is he does so without there being any pre-existing potentiality for such a world. Right? That's really powerful.
Except his own. I mean,
well, that goes back to a question that Nancy asked a while back, 1 or 2 meetings ago. Potentiality, power goes back to the Neoplatonic idea, maybe, that the divine.
Word. I mean, Venomous is all those different things.
Yeah, but Plotinus uses the word for the one. His favorite word is an Aristotelian word, energeia, energy. Actually, what we're usually mean when we speak.
Is the what
at the other end, so to speak, of the Neoplatonic spectrum is an unformed matter as a kind of a prime matter in an Aristotelian sense, right? So when you say the divine potentiality, I don't think that's Thomistic. Okay. Now, however, the fact that you're inclined to say that says that we're not it's hard for us to get. It's hard to get back to Thomas. It's hard to get back to Aristotle. It's easy. It's also hard to get back to Thomas, right? In other words, it doesn't occur to Thomas that therefore there's any potentiality within God, right? So.
In other words, but the potentiality still has this negative resonance.
Yes, that's right.
Which it doesn't for us.
No, well, in the modern world, potentiality is it. Right.
Yes.
There's nothing but potentiality. Yeah. Right. Well, that's not a statement, but potentiality becomes central to it.
Is that because God gave us freedom? The incarnation did?
Well, everything is, maybe. Well, I would say, depends on what you mean by the question, but the premise here would be what? That if somehow or other in the past, at a historical point in time, there was an insurge, or is that the right word? An influx of freedom. There's another word. You squirt something into something. This is
infusion.
Infusion, in some sense. It's just an analogy, right? Yeah, that there was a change that occurs at this point in time. And if you want to keep talking about the thinking now occurring, I can understand your impatience, but you understand I could wait.
Let's wait now.
No. The infusion, this is an Augustinian point, takes time, as it were, to be processed. Right? So this is if it's a real infusion, really into the natural world, right? Then an Aristotelian Thomistic principle would be that the infusion is going to follow the form of that into which it's infused. Now, I would say I would say the thinking now occurring disagrees with Thomas to this extent that Thomas he loves to say that, by the way, that everything follows the form of whatever it's introduced into, right? What I don't think he fully appreciates, and maybe only we can now at this point in history appreciate, is that, and maybe it has to do with the power of this particular substance that was infused, is that this substance not only follows the form, and it's not to say that it doesn't follow the form, but in following the form, it is also transforming the form. It follows and transforms the form, or it transforms the form in a way which is consistent with the form. Right? So there is. You want to go back to your crude analogy there that what, I don't know how you put it. God got bored with Christmas and being a man, and now becoming thought.
Well, it's a 24/7 deal, as opposed to Christmas, which is
Right.
once a
Okay.
year.
Okay. All right. It was my fault to bring it up. But all right. So there was a process.
24/7 gig.
Right. The process, however, is a function of the form into which the freedom has been infused, would be the notion. All right, but to go back to the penultimate question here about instrumentality, back on page 75 with the mercy issue. So God's mercy, let me just finish that thought. So the chief example of omnipotence is God's mercy, and we can understand in the context of everything that Thomas writes, that's a greater manifestation of omnipotence than this metaphysical omnipotence that I've just described to you, which I would say is kind of powerful, right? You see, but this is even more powerful because it's more an example for Thomas of the divine being doing that which I want to say for which there's no reason. So if you put it metaphysically,
that's the freedom. That's
Yeah.
the free act of grace is the
Right.
mercy
Yeah.
to the created world, which has been created as something other than his own simplicity, his own perfection, and the true act of mercy is the act that only a powerful being that can have on a lesser being to bestow that mercy upon it.
right. And if you read it backwards into the metaphysical omnipotence that I was talking about, that kind of muscular omnipotence of making something where there's no potentiality, it deepens the meaning of that, right? In other words, there's no reason why, apart from this absolute freedom of the divine, there's no reason why the world exists, right? So you could almost say, I'm inclined to say, I'm just freebasing now, right? It's the existence of the world is miraculous. Right? Now, the point is, it's only when we get into quantum mechanics we begin to understand how deeply miraculous it is. It's only in the quantum world that we finally figured out in the 20th century that two subatomic particles could be in the same place at the same time. When I was going to grammar school, I was told, I remember very vividly, that I forget the guy's name, didn't make any difference, I got the idea, right? There was some saint who showed up in Paris one day at noon. He was also seen at Lisbon on the same day at the same hour. Because that was a miracle. Okay? But for Heisenberg, this miracle is at the foundation of the physical universe. See? Okay, so now, so this mercy sheds some light on the absolute lack of necessity for the world's being, so the absolute freedom in which it is rooted, so to speak. As it were, I don't even like rooted. See, you have to clean all this language up. It's not really rooted, but as it were. Then you have to pull the root out. On the other hand, with regard to its subject, mercy, we're still on Thomas now, is not the greatest virtue. Mercy is not the greatest virtue in regard to its subject, unless that subject be greater than all others. So notice, so mercy is not the greatest virtue, but in the case of God, who is the greatest, greater than whom there is none that can be conceived, as Anselm would put it, right? Then in that case, mercy is God's greatest virtue. Right? It's really interesting. So the other passage, which we skipped over because we did it a couple of days ago, where I was just astounded in rereading it to see that we're created in God's image, and God, what does God do? He loves Himself, and so I'm thinking, well, gee, I'm in God's image, I should love myself. And I read the passage and I find out that I got to love God 3 times in order to be in God's image, right? Okay. So, but that's consistent. See, there's a deep consistency. Thomas doesn't spell all this out because he kind of just knows it. He just kind of takes it for granted, right? But the deep consistency is that you could say, well, God loves Himself, and then, right? But that's not the greatest thing for God. The greatest thing for God is mercy. Not that He had to do anything, but that He simply does it for others, you see? That He is not, as it were, satisfied where He could be perfectly, absolutely. I don't know how you couldn't overstate how satisfied He could be loving Himself, could you? You couldn't, you see? So in a certain sense, now, see, Sartre plays with this, not piously, but he's not stupid. Sartre's not stupid. See, so as long as there is a God, the creation is superfluous. It's the superfluity of absolute goodness. And you can't say it's necessary. It's not required. It doesn't come from deficiency. It comes from an excess of actuality, if you could put it that. For one of it, it's tough when you. Yeah.
Wait.
Oh, all right. I can tell you, you're just muttering, or
Can we go back to the
Yeah.
the word omnipotence? or
Okay.
something? Are you saying that Thomas's God is? I don't know enough about the parsing that word. Right? What was omni?
Omnis. Omnis means all. All.
To or for, by which or from everybody. Which is the way.
Well,
which is the way Flanders and Swan defined it.
Okay.
They're relating it to
Well, so you know the answer.
London Transport Diesel engine.
Is this just a prelude? You're going to sing now? You're going to do
No,
this?
not at all. But so above would be one way. That's the first part.
No.
Omni
Is all.
All. So it's all potency. Is that?
All power. All powerful.
But it's all potential.
Well, this is no. It's the Latin term that gets the idea out is potestas. I don't know whether we have. Do we have English derivatives from that? Maybe potent. Probably. Yeah, it must be potent. Must be derivative from potestas. In other words, it's the power of majesty. It's analogously the power of authority. You see, when you speak of the power of the magistrate, you're a lawyer. The power of the magistrate is not the potentiality of the magistrate, right? It's his ability to make things happen. His ability to put you in a slammer for asking questions like you're asking here. Okay? I lack that power.
Good thing.
Okay? I only have potentiality. All right? All right. But God has a positive power to make things happen. As it were, kind of, not just the authority, but the power. In his case, he doesn't have to get the authority from everyone. So within himself, he has the power and the authority to effect things. Which brings back to Aristotle. See, God is, in a very important sense in Thomas, absolutely an efficient cause. Right? He is the efficient cause. He makes things happen. He's effective. Right? Okay. Now, all right, but to come back to the penultimate question, which you also raised a little further down. All right, so finish with the quotation from Thomas. If mercy is sacrifice's true form, then applying Thomas's distinctions, only that sacrifice is pleasing to God that is properly undertaken. That is, by God himself as subject. So here you have implicitly, I don't know whether I make it clear, but it's clear, I think, in the context, that if you're looking for the suitableness of the incarnation, right? God may have saved the world in other ways, right? But if he chose to save it through a sacrifice, the only suitable subject for that sacrifice would be a divine person. So only the divine freedom is suitable. Only divine freedom is I want to say sufficient to be efficient in the causing of the salvation of the world. Not all right, but so therefore it may be proper for God, right, to offer that sacrifice, and that would explain in some way the incarnation. Not God, but man is the proper object of man's sacrifices. All right, so if there's a sacrifice to be offered, God is to offer that sacrifice, as it were, to himself. And of course, that's what theology says. The Christian theology says that God offered the sacrifice to himself. God the Son, who is the same being as the Father, the one God of the Father, offers to the Father, with whom he in being is no different, offers that sacrifice to the Father. So God sacrifices to himself, so to speak, in the incarnation. And when it comes to human beings, man is the proper object of man's sacrifices. So are we to sacrifice? Yes, but the object of our sacrifices, proper object, is man. That is, man is to show mercy, not to God, but to his neighbor. But man's mercy toward his neighbor is neither his neighbor's greatest possible good, since that is God's own self-sacrificing mercy immediately present in his neighbor's very being, going to the idea that each neighbor, like the universe as a whole, is in his very being the merciful creation of the Godhead, nor is it man's greatest good to be merciful to his fellow man, For nor is man's greatest good to be merciful to his fellow man, for he himself is directly related to God in that circle of mercy received, charity returned, in which God is loved as absolutely provident Father. Mercy is to sacrifice as form to matter. So too charity is to prayer. But charity is to mercy. Love of God is to love of...
Could you slow down a little bit?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go over it. I just want to read the whole sentence. Love of God is to love of neighbor, as participated existence is to essence. Therefore, in grace, humanity essentially is mercy or love of neighbor, but this mercy or humanity is actual only in prayerful communion with God. But again, since nature is not destroyed, and this is analogous to the point I was making in a slightly different context, the larger context here, about when the incarnation occurred and in what sense is it still occurring, right? Nature is not destroyed. Since existence naturally follows form, charity is simultaneously love of neighbor. Now, you want me to zero in on that tough sentence,
Well,
I guess.
the proportions.
Yeah, mercy is to sacrifice, its form is to matter. All right. So, in other words, if there's to be an appropriate sacrifice offered by men, human beings, the appropriate sacrifice has got to be in the form of mercy. Human beings are not in a position, therefore, to sacrifice to God. This is the proof of the inadequacy of those sacrifices. You read the...
Goats to the temple.
Yeah, if you read this is right in the New Testament in the Epistle to the Hebrews, right? Which is focused on the temple and in which Jesus is understood to be the only perfect lamb. The reason why the sacrifices are annual in the temple, according to the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews, is that they never got it right. Right? There was never a perfect sacrifice able to be offered, either in terms of the victim or the offerer. Right? So the perfect sacrifice in the Epistle to the Hebrews is that the priest and the victim, being one and the same, and both being the divine Son, that is the perfect sacrifice. All right. So when it comes to human sacrifice is not to be offered to God; it's to be offered to one's fellow man. But the only way in which that can be appropriate is in the form of mercy. All right. So human sacrifices have to be informed by mercy. So the Augustinian point. This is the tougher side of Augustine. Augustine makes the point that if you give a man a cup of water, you don't do him any good, spiritually speaking. But if you give him a cup of water in the name of Christ, then that counts. So that's Augustine's pedestrian way of saying that what you do for your fellow man is only valid, is only truly effective if it is done as an act of spiritual mercy, not simply. And therefore, well, it goes back to the penultimate question. And therefore, the mercy idea is perhaps eventually, in some sense, connected with being at the disposal of another. Do you see? That is, the act that you perform is not done out of any need of yours at all, whether it's ego gratification or self-satisfaction or whatever. You see, it's done purely for the sake of the other. And that's the model for that.
Talmud.
Well, sure. Well, of course. But theologically here, the model for that is the divine mercy.
Yeah.
For which
Now, what's the word for mercy? What's the Greek mercy mean? What's the Latin mercy?
I don't know what he uses here. It could
mercy,
be
the English word is so...
It could be misericordia, but I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the text.
Because the word in
Misericordia,
English is so,
I would guess, but I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
We'll find out.
Yeah.
Okay. Does that answer your question about the proportions?
Not the matter form part.
Okay, all right, good. So, human virtue. I go back to Augustine again because he just was not a politically correct guy. So he just tell you straight out. Okay. Now he was very learned and very respectful of the classical tradition. Augustine was, right. He was looking throughout it for the truth, for salvation, for God, whatever he's looking for. But when he found it in Christianity, when he looked back, and again you see this in the City of God especially, he looked back on the ancient notion of virtue. He never actually said this, but there's ascribed to him a very short phrase, which, however, sums up his attitude. And that is, he thought that the virtues of the pagans were splendid vices. Splendid vices, though. All right? So, in other words, from the point of view of creation ex nihilo, from the point of view of the potentiating of all divinity in the world, it now becomes created divinity. It is no longer actually any longer self-sufficient, which was, in a certain sense, the very concrete embodiment of what it meant to be divine. The prime mover is the most perfectly self-sufficient being in the entire universe of being. And to the extent to which there's a little bit of divinity in me, there's a self-sufficiency at my core that I ought to strive to live in accord with. And in some sense, it transcends, at the end of the ethics, my humanity. But in my naked humanity, as I refer to it in the case of Descartes, in my naked humanity, I'm hardly appear to be self-sufficient. I like to think I am. But of course, if anybody turns off the gas pump here, or the water lines, or the electricity, boy, I'm really up the creek. Now, of course, I live in Pennsylvania, so I have some dirt. Maybe I can quickly grow something, But if I'm living here on 95th Street, I've got problems, right? I'm not quite self-sufficient. All right. So the splendid vices idea. So in other words, the point being that all of now I'm using the term in just not too technical sense, but maybe I am. All of the natural good of the world, all right, is relativized by Christianity, right? So what is naturally good is now, if it's only naturally good,
it's deficient.
Well, but it's inexcusably deficient. Yeah. All right. In other words, it's a splendid vice. It's a splendid state of sinfulness. All right. So natural good, as natural, is the matter that in and of itself is insufficient to, as it were, merit divine favor or whatever. Of course, it never is, right? And therefore, if there's any merit, if there's any genuine, real goodness to human goodness, it can only be, that it's informed by that virtue which is the likeness in the world of the divine virtue of mercy, right? I would say, in the context of which becomes a big issue in the course of history now, the total selflessness of the Creator. The Creator's creation was radically selfless, right? And all true human good between human beings must be motivated by that kind of selflessness.
Is it the model or the fact? In other words, it could be a matter of fact whether a given natural event is transformed by grace, rather than okay, it has this perfect legalistic imitation of selflessness in which you can drive yourself crazy.
Yeah.
No,
that's a good point. Grace. Well, that's the term grace.
Yeah. For instance, like just thinking of Derrida's book on the gift.
Right.
The entire logic of that, which at a certain point you want to sort of like just throw it into the heap because it leaves out the fact that there is grace, there is graciousness, there is this can actually occur.
But see, grace is a particular application of that broader idea that the world was created for no reason.
Yeah. Well, which way around is it actually?
What meaning?
Well, in other words, is the world was created for no reason? Is this a logical attempt to give a picture of the intuition of grace, or is
okay?
I mean, it's an important point.
Yeah.
Or is it the other way around? That it really is this way. The logical analogon is what the way things really are, and so we've sort of got it under control by having this picture of it.
You forget that grace is amazing, as the song says.
Indeed. I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just
all right. Well, yeah. The only way I could I think sticking to the context with Thomas, I would say you would answer it. The priority, grace comes first there, right? So the sense of control, I think, is not there.
Well, but I mean
Yeah.
control in the sense of that
You can't engineer. You cannot acquire. In other words,
you can't engineer by perfectly imitating
right?
the mouth.
Yeah, you can't. You
Yeah,
can't.
right.
You can try, but you
Yeah.
can't. By definition, you can't do
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
That's right. All right. Okay, let's get a little closer to Descartes. I think we have enough context for that. The only other thing, I've said it, I guess, but maybe if I draw it, it's a little more vivid. Not draw it, but just diagram it out a little bit. In other words, this and it's right here on this page, mercy and sacrifice idea. I analogize it at the bottom of that page to the relationship of esse and essentia, all right? And the simplest way of putting it is essentia, esse is the original contribution of Thomas, right? It's the infinitive of the Latin to be, right? But the infinitive form, as opposed to, let's say, entitas, which would be an entity, it always has the connotation philosophically of an activity, of an act. Now, it's not a. I mean, it's kind of like a noun. It functions like a noun in a sentence, but it's a verb. It's verbal. Okay. All right. And so this is, as it were, the act of being in Thomas. The act of being, and the key thing is that he's making a distinction between esse and essentia. So if I were to, I've already screwed it up. Well, let's see if I can't redeem it here. Well, I can kind of. Yeah, but I mean, something like that. Oh, here, I forgot I can erase this. Okay. And then to make it really clear, in Thomas, the original point is that esse exceeds. That's the. It transcends. It's a larger notion than essentia, or putting it another way, essence, essentia. The eternal actualities, and the gods, and the divine in me, and the divine in everything that might be in any Greek universe. All of that now is exceeded by an act of being, right? That in other words, from Thomas's point of view, the esse comes from outside of the essentia, as it were, right? And so, if I were to take away the esse, this essentia would not really be. Right?
So whereas essence is the red rock bottom rooftop top.
Right.
In Aristotle, essence, as everything else has been, the essence is into the created world.
Right.
But esse is
Right.
the divine being itself. God's being
ipsum
is,
esse.
yeah,
Ipsum.
Yeah.
Ipse itself. Ipse is something like the autos of the Greek, the itself, right? The thing itself. Yeah. Okay. So ipsum esse, being itself, is God. And the created being, or all the essences that exist within that, realm is too static a word, but within the sea, Thomas was kind of a poet. He got off on the wrong track. He became a philosopher and a theologian. But he speaks of the ipsum esse as a vast ocean of being, right? So he's got that notion of just a vast expanse of water. You can imagine in the medieval world how big the ocean might be imagined to be, right? So God is this limitless ocean, might be better to fill it out, right? And so if there are any, I'm doing this now, I'm ruining his idea, but if there are any islands, if there anything's floating in that sea, it's floating in the sea. Take away the sea, and these things aren't going anywhere.
Among their floating islands.
Okay. So now, but the metaphysical point is that then for Thomas, esse becomes actuality, right? And essence, which used to be in the Aristotelian world, used to be actuality. That's what I'm saying. That is potentiated. That becomes only potential in this. In other words, it becomes. Remember, I said to you, you have to be careful in philosophy. Everything depends on the context. Well, the otherwise immaterial essences are in a Thomistic world. They're material. That is not to say they're corporeal, but they have taken on the role of matter vis-a-vis the actuality of the divine creative gift of being. Right? So left to themselves, they are now. Here's where your potentialities come in. Essences are taking on intrinsic potentiality, and in and of themselves, they are no longer actualities. And so when you think of Leibniz comes along and says, this is the best of all possible worlds, as we'll see, right? And you wonder about what he's talking about, but notice he chooses his word carefully. He says the best world that he could think of is the best possible, by which he means that given the demands made upon the divine computer, right? Leibniz's God is implicitly the computer that we're living with today. Given that mind, that infinite divine reason that God is for Leibniz after Descartes, it certainly would know all the possible essences that could be actualized. This is Leibniz. All the possible essences. So these essences are there somehow or other, waiting. In fact, not just waiting, demanding of the divine mind that they be realized, right? And now the divine mind's got a problem. It's got an infinite number of essences. How's it going to deal with this, right? So it selects, from Leibniz's point of view, from this infinite array of possible essences that could be made to exist, that particular combination that will make, it's a forced choice, right? That will make the best possible world. Not the best, absolutely best, but given the demands of all of these essences, if I'm going to make anything actual, I'm going to select from them the best possible arrangement. Right? That's Leibniz's idea. But where would he get the idea? You see, where would Leibniz, was he stupid? Didn't they teach him Aristotle in school? Where would he get the idea that the essences of things were possible things to exist? You see what I'm saying? And he is introduced, however, into the creation. He subtly introduces a sense of necessity. He introduces a reason, in principle, for the existence of this particular world, because this is the best possible selection that a rational God could have made if he was disposed to make any world at all. All right.
Gets that idea from Dr. Pangloss.
Huh? Okay. So the root of that Leibnizian possibility, and therefore, of course, the possible essence is what happens. I'm thinking ahead now to the Americans. Once the essences are possibilities, possibly existing, that is, in that sense, I wonder how long it's going to take for the possibility to kind of seep into the essences. Maybe they're kind of saying, gee, maybe I could be a better essence than I now am. Maybe I could grow, maybe I could evolve into, you see what I'm saying? So, but to get to that coding of possibility that kind of gradually sinks into the modern essence, right? First you have to make it clear, crystal clear, as Thomas does, right? That those essences aren't actuality, right? And that they may not be possible essences in the Leibnizian sense, right? But their actual existence is something that transcends their own being, all right, in some critical way, and that's the act of creation. All right. So now let's take a look at Descartes a little bit. He says on page 78, in the bottom third or so, quoting from Discourse on the Method, I noticed that while I was thus wished to think all things false, it was absolutely essential that the I who thought this should be somewhat. And remarking that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so. And by the way, he doesn't say that in the Meditations. He doesn't say. He only says, "I think, therefore I am," which has become the famous line. He only says that in the Discourse on the Method or in the letters that he writes to explain the Meditations. The key thing in the Meditations, this is why you never trust the thinker. The key thing in the Meditations is that he leaves the therefore out. Because what he's emphasizing in the actual experience of the Meditations is that he can't even say, I think, unless he is. Right? If he just so it's not, he doesn't set it up. First of all, it's not a syllogism, as he himself makes clear. It looks like a syllogism, I think, therefore I am. But what's missing from that syllogism is the universal premise the universal premise, would, if it were a syllogism, would have to be everything that thinks is, I think, therefore I is. Okay? But the whole point is that he doesn't know whether there is anything else that is, let alone whether everything else is, right? So he can't start with a universal premise. If he gets to a universal, and I call it here a kind of universal medium, right? A universal instrument, if he gets to it, it's going to be the product of his meditation. It's not going to be the starting point, which is another way of saying, see, that's just a very technical, abstract, schoolroom way of saying that if he's going to get to the world as the result of his meditation, he's going to get to the world as the product of his meditation. He cannot start with the world. And of course he knows that, and so he doesn't. He starts by setting aside the world altogether, radically speaking. Right?
It's actually the fact that he doesn't construct the syllogism that gives that text its sudden sense of modernity.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That he's not actually working.
Yeah, well, he
you read
said...
it, suddenly you feel you're right, you're in the middle of the modern...
Yeah, he says, just to skip, I may come back, but let's skip to that. On page 81 at the bottom, again from the Discourse on the Method, he said, among the different branches of philosophy I had in my younger days to a certain extent studied logic. I observed in respect to logic that the syllogisms and the greater part of the other teachings serve better in explaining to others those things that one knows than in learning what is new. All right? So he explicitly sets aside the syllogisms, which of course go back to Aristotle, the great syllogismizer. Now, I made some notes to myself here without going off too far, and it relates to this little issue we had about modern versus ancient science and so forth. The syllogism, of course, the classic, the simplest form of the syllogism is all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, and therefore Socrates is mortal, right? And Descartes' criticism of the syllogism is that if I want to explain to you why Socrates is lying there in the coffin, I can explain it to you, right? But I haven't discovered anything new there, right? That's it. And this particular form of the syllogism is a straight deduction, starting with the major premise, which he doesn't have: all men are mortal. If that's true, assuming that's true, and Socrates is a man, and all men are mortal, then it follows. I deduce from there, right? And now Peirce comes up. Peirce's originality in logic, I mean, he's got profound originality, but the simplest form of Peirce's originality is that, and this is what makes him so different from Descartes, and so makes these Americans kind of problematically modern. I mean, they're certainly modern, but there's something wrong here, right? Peirce doesn't throw out the syllogism. Peirce was a logician. He was a mathematician. His father was the mathematician. And he was as good or better than his father was a mathematician, but he thought of himself first and foremost as a logician. So he has great respect for syllogisms, even as late as the 19th century in America, of all places, right? And he's a working scientist, so he's not... Right? So how is that possible? Because Peirce understands this, that this 1, 2, 3, all are, this is, therefore, deductive syllogism, right? But he also understands that the inductive syllogism, which is integral to scientific practice, right, is what? See if I can do this right now. It's going to be Socrates is mortal. I think this is right. Check me out here, Chuck. Right? Induction is that Socrates is mortal. All these mortals, every mortal I've come across, you have to pluralize it in order to get the inductive part of it. You have to pluralize it. But
and they are
all these dead things.
All these men you've come across.
Well, all these dead things I've come across. Each of them is a man.
Okay.
So I can inductively assume until proven otherwise, right, that all men are mortal. So the major premise of the deductive syllogism is the conclusion of the inductive syllogism. I think I did it right. Yeah. Okay. Now here's Peirce. Peirce invents a whole new category of syllogisms, I guess, or what he would call reasoning, because this is a process of reasoning. Inductive and deductive we know from, and this is what Descartes is complaining about. But Peirce's syllogism runs this way. This thing here is dead. All men are dead. All men are mortal, sooner or later. I guess, a good guess, a likely hypothesis is that this guy is a man. In other words, what Peirce calls the abductive reasoning, hypothetical reasoning, is he doesn't throw out the syllogism. He just look what he does. He does this. He says, where does he start?
Socrates is dead.
See if I'm doing this right. Socrates is dead.
All men die.
Yeah, all men die. So Socrates is probably a man, right? Okay. So the conclusion is 2, right? Conclusion is the middle premise, and so he does this. He does 1 or 3, or either way. 3, 1.
3, 1, 2.
3, 1, 2. Right. So now, what's interesting about that is that there's a radical discontinuity introduced there. You see what I'm saying? In other words, that's out of order. All right. So when Descartes went from the classical syllogism, he went. You'll notice in the text selection from the text, he went to the notion of order, right, as the key to scientific understanding, right. Whereas Peirce wants to say. Peirce wants to allow, and the Americans in general want to allow for a certain amount of irreducible chaos. They want to allow for a certain amount of irrationality, if you want. But they want to understand that as not an alternative to reason, not an alternative to the idea, the Hegelian idea. This will be most important in the case of Peirce, right? So that in American consciousness you have this kind of disordered arrangement, however. I mean, I still got 3, 1, 2. I've still got 1, 2, 3. I just don't have them in the natural order. See, but I have, right, in the natural order, I have an order that is disconcerting, right? And that's the opening for evolution of ideas, the evolution, if you want, you could say, of reason, or the evolution of mind in Peirce is there in this simple, playful focusing on
that
the
you can move from probability to probability. I mean, that's where your Tipler actually goes. The whole thing is he takes.
But that probability is not a deficiency. It's not a function of.
Yeah.
See, it's more. Descartes' genius is that he takes our weakness and makes it a strength. Right. The weakness, from a Thomistic point of view, is that the human mind is defective. It's everything it thinks is doubtful. It's at least doubtful because it's a product of a defective mind. Now, Descartes. I don't know what the metaphor for this is, right? But in other words, making your, Paul's way of putting it, in my strength is my weakness. Now, Descartes didn't do it the same way, but in my weakness is my strength, Paul, right? So, in my weakness is my strength. I'm a doubtful creature mentally. Can I use that fact, right? That's what Descartes does. So he does take, right? And so he makes of his instrumental reasoning, he makes it the instrument, you see, of
mercy.
Okay. Well, maybe.
Well, I mean, that's what you say, really.
Well, no, we don't know. That's a spiritual quality, so I don't think we can make a judgment about it. We can assume.
You make that step that
Okay.
that the proposition that science is going to be for the benefit of humanity
Right.
is derived from that notion of the appropriateness of mercy.
But the question of the selflessness of the motive, whether it's mercy or philanthropy, right?
But you don't make that.
No, I don't. I'm just saying. But it's an open. I think it's, to use his language, it's an open question, right?
If one major premise to shift this
Right.
syllogism
Right.
is that American philosophy embraced chaos more than. I mean, that's one of the signal. The signal historical observations that you would make, right? And if Peirce is an American,
right,
then why is Heidegger a European?
Well, are you trying to give me a syllogism from which nothing follows, or
You're
what?
using an Aristotelian
I'm just trying
syllogism.
to.
No, that's not a syllogism. You might as well have ended it by saying that why do elephants have trunks?
That's right.
Well,
It wasn't
but
the
Heidegger certainly is in my mind, the
Right.
penultimate exponent of chaos. I mean, certainly, he's the guy who came up with the uncertainty principle. Did he not?
No. I'm sorry. Heisenberg.
Heisenberg, sorry.
Two different
Sorry,
people.
okay,
You
sorry,
meant
sorry.
Heisenberg?
I meant Heisenberg. Yeah.
But that's not uncertainty. Isn't
Yeah.
chaos.
No, but Heisenberg. See, okay.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Okay. You lost me about Heisenberg. The question
Heisenberg,
makes sense in
yeah.
Heisenberg's case to me. It
Yeah.
makes sense to me. And the connection is this. It's somewhat circuitous, but that's what happens after Jefferson and Emerson and Peirce. What happens? It gets more complicated. Heisenberg is speaking in somewhere in the 1920s, 1920 thereabouts, when this came to the fore.
Yeah.
Okay. When that happened, as soon as John Dewey, our American pragmatist, descendant of Peirce and James and so forth, as soon as he got wind of this, he said, wow, that's great. They have just discovered in scientific method what we've been saying here all along.
Here in America.
Yeah. So in other words, Peirce has been saying this. Peirce is, people have called Peirce our American Aristotle. I mean, he's really deep. And so Peirce, he had understood this conceptually before it emerged in, as Dewey says, in scientific experiment and investigation and in method. Okay, but it was anticipated, as Dewey noted immediately when it happened, in pragmatism. Yeah. So that's the answer to that question. But I don't want to go over this time. So I'm going to.
Yeah.
I want to go to page. Certainly to page 81. I think we jumped ahead there a moment ago. On page 81, I just want to call attention to the fact that he says about 5-6 lines down from the top of 81, interest centers on this concrete factual freedom that reason has become in time, in space, but as it appears to itself, free from history. Right? So in other words, this relates to the notion that Descartes is appropriating what I call the transcendental form of natural reason, which I'm saying in the text is effectively worked out by Thomas. Because Thomas's notion is the exemplary reason which God is. God is, one way of understanding causality in Thomas is that because he takes likeness so seriously, right? In other words, if I told you the general principle in Thomas that works in every department is that an agent produces its likeness. So if the world is created by God in the image of God, then the world and the human mind in particular would be a likeness of its cause, of its agent cause. Right? So the divine mind has produced in the human mind its image. So that warrants Thomas having an understanding by denying certain limitations to the divine exemplar, certain limitations that pertain to the created likeness. Right? By denying certain limitations to it, he has a pretty good idea to begin with, so to speak, of what that divine mind is like. And what that divine mind is like is that it is an intentional mind, the Word of God, the Son, being the intention of the Father, you see, but a perfect intention, therefore one in being with the Father, infinitely perfect intention, do you see? And it is through that intention that secondarily he is able to intend the world as something other than the divine being, as a created being. Descartes, if you look at what's going on in the Meditations, Descartes has the same kind of transcendental reason as the res cogitans. He has it, however, as explicitly a finite thinker. He distinguishes himself from the idea of God that he has in the third meditation. He has an idea of God as an infinite being, and by analogy, an infinite thinker, whereas he is certainly a finite. He's a thinking thing, and certainly limited, or else he would have made himself God. He wouldn't have any questions or any problems. So, and he can't account for his own existence from moment to moment, from now to now. Okay? So there must be some power, right? And that power he has an idea of, and that idea that he has of the infinite being of God is what he calls a positive infinity. It's not limited, right? He has an idea that there is positive infinite being, right? And since he's a finite being, he cannot be the author of that being, right? Now there's so many issues here. Right there, he's already borrowing from Thomas and imitating Thomas's understanding in his own subjectivity of the fact that the divine mind, remember I said, unlike an Aristotelian universe, the priority, when we talk about potential knowledge, the potential knowledge is that there must be something there to be known. Whereas a creative intellect, like the divine intellect of Thomas Aquinas, does not presuppose the existence of the world in order to know the world. His knowing the world precedes its being, or is the cause of its being. Right? His having the thought of the world, so to speak, makes the world to be. Right? That's the intentionality of it. Okay. So notice that Descartes' problem is not, his problem in the Meditations is unintelligible without that framework, because what is his problem? And how does he solve it? He assumes that he's like God, as he says very explicitly, but seriously he does. Now he says, I've got all these ideas in my head. And I'm thinking these ideas. So what is his question? Well, could I be responsible for the existence of all of these things? Maybe these are nothing more than the products of my own mind, do you see? Which would be, right? But now he finds an idea of positive infinite being, and he says, wait a minute, I cannot be, my thinking of that idea cannot be the origin of the existence or the being of the reality corresponding to it. Okay? So it's a kind of negative reflection of the transcendental intentionality of the creative mind as understood by Thomas, applied to the creature, the finite thinking thing that he is in the Meditations. Right? Now, so that's what I call the transcendental, well, it's a little more complicated. So in Thomas, the human likeness of that divine creative mind is the transcendental form of natural reason. It's the transcendental form of reason in nature, in the human being, right? In the human mind.
As a transcendental form of the reason that's in the human mind.
Yes,
yeah.
Or that the reason that's in the human mind has now, unlike the form that has in Aristotle, that fleeting, unintentional form, it now has an intentionality, right? And that's the transcendentality of the form of human reason now, and it's for Thomas, it's the likeness in nature of the divine mind. What Descartes can be understood to be doing is assuming that transcendental form of natural reason and then bracketing the natural part of it. You understand? He takes the transcendental form of natural reason from Thomas and then he brackets or calls into question that it is a natural entity or that there is a nature corresponding to what that mind understands. Right? So he prescinds initially, so that's when he abstracts himself, as it were, from the universe, from the world of his natural experience. He prescinds initially from that nature in order, in some sense, to come back to it from another direction, on a firmer grounding. The firmer grounding being the cogito. Right? Now, the other thing I wanted to just say about that was that what he borrows, he says in the reading there that he didn't have the grace to be a theologian, and he didn't want to be a philosopher because it was useless. I mean, nothing was going on for 2,000 years, so and there were no computer jobs. So, his problem was, what was he going to do? If you're what do? You start your own company. Okay, what do? Right? You start your own thing. Okay? Now, but here's the point I want to make. When he started his own thing, he didn't start, unlike God, he didn't start ex nihilo, right? So he, even though he prescinds from history, even though he doesn't, whatever that is, refer to it, he takes from theology what? He takes from theology what Thomas Aquinas told him is the absolute firmness of theology. In other words, its indubitable quality. You have to learn. You don't have to spell indubitable, right? Theology, Thomas tells him, right, is the queen of the sciences because it cannot be. Its foundations are undoubtable because it's the Word of God, right? So he takes the form. Go back to form and matter. He takes the form of theology, scientific, the indubitability of theology, and he marries it with the matter of philosophy. What was the matter with philosophy? Its subject matter? Not at all. Descartes' interest in the world, in human being. Do you see what I'm saying? But he wants a useful science, and he can't. So he wants the subject matter. Philosophy has the broad sense, you understand, includes the sciences in the medieval world, right? He takes the human sciences as he takes from it not its form. He doesn't want its form. Its form has gone nowhere for 2,000 years. But he wants its subject matter. He wants the world and mankind as the subject matter. He wants the science that deals with that now, unlike the preceding philosophy, to be firmly grounded.
So he's extending the analogy, the analogous relationship of natural reason to divine reason to the issue of indubitability. Mm-hmm. That, in other words, the indubitability is no longer simply that it's given by metaphysics or scholastic metaphysics or theology, but he's going to find a ground for that indubitability within natural reason itself.
Right, absolutely. And in that sense, he's on good theological ground, as he himself is at pains to point out, because he was created in the image of God, and he points out somewhere very subtle, it's very nice, I hope you got it. Since this thing that we're talking about is a soul, this res cogitans, he doesn't have a body yet, right? This thing is immaterial in the corporeal sense. You have to be careful here, okay? And since it is, he says, any artificer, God is an artificer, right? And this drives Heidegger, not Heisenberg, it drives Heidegger off the wall. And since God has made, he's an artificer, he has fashioned this creature that Descartes' thinking thing is, of course, every artificer puts his mark, puts his stamp on the product of his art. He signs the picture, do you see? But now, says Descartes, since this is an immaterial thing that I am, it's not in one part of me that I have the mark of the Creator. Right? Spiritual substances don't come apart. Right? So he's thorough. The whole being of the consciousness is coextensive. So he says it goes back and forth in the text. He is the image of God. He is the idea of God, and the idea of God is in him. He's got that kind of ambiguous identity with the idea of God. So there's a very deliberate, very conscious. I mean, maybe not all the ramifications, right? But there's a very deliberate availing himself of the analogy of being, as Thomas would understand it, right? But employing it now in the service of mankind, and doing so in an explicitly, I want to say worldly way, but it's an oversimplification because this worldliness has now been informed by, maybe this was the point you were making, it's now been informed by a theological form of indubitability. Right? In other words, it's an abstraction from the divine revelation, but it's applying in some sense.
There's some point, I don't know where it is, but in Heidegger, in which he actually makes this point that the issue of certitude, that is for Descartes, is clearly an extension of the issue of certitude that comes from Aquinas.
Yes, yeah. And where does certitude become an issue when
obviously in theological.
When the whole world's otherwise given indubitable eternal existence has been radically called into question. Yeah. So this is, in a certain sense, Descartes' meditation is it could be a kind of pedestrian application of that kind of lurking anxiety.
Okay, I don't know if to bring this is.
Well, we're on free time, so you can say anything you want.
I need 2 hours to actually ask the fucking questions. Excuse me.
Well said.
In faith and philosophy, and at a different angle here, you touch upon points in Augustine and in Descartes in which the issue of how you're going to conduct this investigation into the nature of the soul or the mind involves a attempt to separate